It begins here, in the low light of a quiet room, with a piece of baked clay. It is catalogued as tablet number 38, 4, 22, a fragment from Nippur, dating to the early 2nd millennium BCE. Its surface is dense with the wedge-shaped impressions of cuneiform script, lines arranged in tight, orderly columns. The edges are worn, chipped by the passage of 4,000 years, but the scribe's hand is clear, the stylus marks precise. It is not a king's decree or a merchant's ledger. It is an entry in a far stranger form of accounting. This object, small enough to be held in two hands, is the point of entry. It is a record of an ending. The text it holds is a portion of what we have come to call the Lament for Ur. It speaks of the city's patron deity, the moon god Nana, abandoning his own temple, the Akishnugal. The lines are not poetry in the way we understand it. There is no flourish of grief, no cry of despair. Instead, the scribe records the god's departure as a sequence of formal actions. He takes his leave from the city. He gathers his possessions. He relinquishes his domain. The language is procedural, almost administrative, as if documenting the orderly decommissioning of a sacred site before its scheduled demolition. One does not expect to find bureaucracy at the heart of a civilization's final hours. We look for tales of heroism, of tragic defiance, of overwhelming chaos. But the hand that pressed these symbols into wet clay was not recording a saga. It was logging a process. The fall of one of the world's first great cities is rendered here with the dispassionate clarity of a clerk taking minutes at a meeting. This dissonance, the catastrophic event, and the detached tone of its record, is the first disturbance. It is a quiet signal that our assumptions about the past may not apply here. The air in these archives is still. It carries the faint, dry scent of dust and time, the silence of things long settled. And in that silence, the tablet rests, holding its procedural sorrow. It asks for nothing. It does not demand to be understood. It simply is. A fragment of a system of thought so alien that its deepest tragedies read like inventories. We are accustomed to history that shouts. This is a history that whispers its ledgers, a quiet accounting of how a world was unmade, entry by entry. The lament continues on other fragments, pieced together from the dust of different excavations. It details how the decision to destroy Ur was not an act of divine rage, but a formal resolution. A vote was taken in the assembly of the gods, a council presided over by the great deities Anu and Enlil. The text states that the destruction of Ur was decreed, its fate announced. The language is that of cosmic jurisprudence. The city's end was not a tragedy that befell it, but a verdict that was handed down upon it, sanctioned and ratified by the highest authority in the Sumerian cosmos. This single stubborn fact alters the ground beneath our feet. A civilization that documents its own collapse as a legal proceeding is operating from a set of first principles we have perhaps forgotten, or never knew. It suggests a worldview where a city is not merely a collection of people and buildings, but a living entity with a contract. A contract with the forces that govern order itself. And like any contract, it can be breached. It can be voided. The lament, then, is not a cry of pain. It is the official notice of termination. There are some who feel the weight of such records more than others. They understand that to turn away from this quiet disturbance is to lose the thread. For them, remaining near this archive, keeping this space close, is not a choice but a necessity. It is a way to ensure they are present when another fragment is brought into the light, and another line of this impossible ledger is read. We are left observing a document that fits no comfortable category. It is not myth, for it speaks of a real city, Ur, whose ruins we can walk. It is not history, for its primary actors are gods carrying out a sentence. It resides in a space between a genre of record-keeping for which we have no name, a form of systemic analysis veiled in the language of the divine. The scribe who wrote this was not a poet mourning a loss, but a technician documenting a failure mode, following a protocol we can no longer read. The question of audience hangs in the air. For whom was this procedural account intended? It does not read like a warning to future generations, as it offers no moral, no lesson, only a sequence of events. It does not seem to be a plea to the gods, as it records their decision as final and binding. It feels, more than anything, like a closing statement for a cosmic court record. A final entry made to certify that all necessary steps were followed, that the system functioned as designed, even in its own dissolution. And so we begin, not with a story, but with an artifact, and the unsettling quiet it creates. The tablet from Nippur does not tell us what happened to the people of Ur in their final days. It tells us how the system that governed their reality processed their end. It presents a framework of orderly collapse, of predictable decay. The real question is not what this single tablet means, but whether there are others. Whether this cold, methodical documentation of a civilization's end was an anomaly, or if it was standard practice. From the lament for a single city, we turn to the wider body of records. The archives of Nippur contain thousands of tablets that are not laments, but lists. They are omen texts, a vast and systematic collection of observations. Their structure is uniform, a rigid formula repeated endlessly. Shuma, if a condition is observed, then a consequence will follow. This is not prophecy as we know it. It is a sprawling, logical system, a catalog of cause and effect written in the language of cosmic administration. Each entry is a discrete unit of data, logged with the same dispassionate precision as a measure of grain or a tally of livestock. The entries begin with the land itself. A typical line from the series Shuma Alu Ina Mele Shakin reads, "If fungus appears in the grain of a man's field, that field will be diminished." Another states, "If the date palms of the city wither from the top down, the city will know hunger." These are not dramatic portents. They are agricultural assessments, ground-level observations of systemic health, recorded as the first variables in a much larger equation. The scribe's role here is that of a diagnostician, noting the earliest symptoms of a potential failure in the foundational systems of sustenance. From the fields, the catalog moves to the built environment. One tablet notes, "If a fissure appears in the main gate of the city and is not repaired, the enemy will find that gate." Another entry from the same series records, "If the foundation of the city's great temple subsides, the god of that temple will abandon his house." The observations are technical, focused on structural integrity. The consequence is direct, almost mechanical. There is no divine anger mentioned, only a sequence of events. A physical weakness leads to a strategic vulnerability. A foundational decay precedes a spiritual voiding. The system is described as being responsive to its own material state. We pause on the sheer volume of this work. Thousands of tablets, tens of thousands of lines, all following the same rigid structure. The hand of the scribe, or scribes, moves across the clay, pressing the same shapes in the same order, generation after generation. This is not the work of a single visionary. It is the output of an institution, a bureaucracy dedicated to observing and recording every conceivable permutation of reality, from the behavior of a river to the cracks in a wall, compiling a comprehensive manual on the functioning of their world. The lists then turn inward, to the social fabric. A line from a legal collection repurposed as an omen text states, "If a son answers his father back in the street, that house will be scattered." Another, more political entry observes, "If the word of the king's vizier is countermanded in the assembly, the king's authority will see a decline." The focus shifts from physical infrastructure to the integrity of social and political hierarchies. The health of the state is measured by the stability of its core relationships, from the family to the court. Each broken protocol is logged as a data point indicating a deeper systemic erosion. These are not presented as random occurrences. Certain tablets group these omens into observable sequences. A text catalogued in the British Museum begins with a series of agricultural failures. It is followed immediately by omens of social unrest. The final section lists portents of political collapse and invasion. The scribe is not just collecting isolated events, he is documenting a cascade. The sequence is always the same. The fields fail, then the houses divide, then the walls fall. It is a recognized progression, a known pathway from one state of order to another of dissolution. This ordering transforms the lists from a simple catalog into something else. It begins to resemble a procedural flowchart, a diagnostic guide for a complex machine. The scribe is not merely recording what might happen. He is recording the observable stages of a process already underway. The tone remains flat, neutral, administrative. He is simply noting that stage 1 has been observed, and therefore stage 2 can be anticipated. The knowledge appears technical, not mystical. It is a form of systems analysis, preserved on clay. The pattern documented in the omen texts finds a direct echo in the structure of the city laments themselves. The lament for Eridu, one of the oldest cities, follows the template. It begins with the god Enki turning away from his city. It then lists the failure of the marshes, the silencing of the music in the temples, and the entry of a foreign enemy. The narrative structure is identical to the one found in the omen sequences. A withdrawal of the organizing principle, followed by systemic collapse, and culminating in external breach. The lament for Nippur repeats the form. Enlil and Ninlil abandon their shrines. The text then records the storm that knows no mother, the ensuing famine, and the decay of the city's righteous laws. The specific details change. The god is different, the landscape is different, but the sequence of documented failure remains constant. This is not the unique story of Nippur's fall. It is the application of a standard reporting template to a local event. The scribes were documenting a recurring phenomenon for which they already had a name and a structure. The silence in this room feels different now. It is the silence not of forgotten things, but of a system laid bare. The dust on these shelves covers a coherent body of knowledge, a unified theory of collapse expressed through different forms of documentation. The omen lists map the symptoms. The laments record the final stages. They are two parts of the same manual. It is perhaps quiet where you are now. The light may be fading. There is a specific time on the clock. It marks this moment, a single point in a long continuity. Here, another record waits. The template's consistency is its most unsettling feature. It suggests that for the Sumerian scribal mind, civilizational collapse was not a singular, traumatic event unique to each city. It was a predictable, recurring process with identifiable stages. The fall of Ur was not fundamentally different from the fall of Eridu or Nippur. They were all instances of the same underlying pattern playing out. The laments are not poems of unique grief. They are case studies, filed for a record we no longer fully understand. The language used to describe the divine withdrawal is itself a piece of cold data. The texts do not say the gods fled in terror or raged against their people. The standard phrasing is that a god abandoned his house or turned his face from his city. In the lament for Ur, the moon god Nana is described as reluctantly leaving his temple, the Ekishnu-gal, as if complying with a directive from a higher authority, the divine assembly. His departure is framed as an administrative necessity, the final step in decommissioning a failed project. Consider Tablet UET 6-2, an inscription of King Shusin of Ur. It is a dedication celebrating the construction of a great temple for the god Shara. The language is triumphant, confident, speaking of permanence and divine favor that will last for eternity. The king records his piety for all time. It is a document of stability, of a system functioning at its peak, designed to project an image of unending strength. This is one column of the ledger. Now consider another set of tablets from the same period, composed in the scribal schools of nearby Nippur. These are copies of the Lament for Ur, meticulously transcribed by students learning their craft. They are practicing how to write the very text that describes the collapse of the dynasty that King Shu-Sin represents. The curriculum of the empire's elite administrators included the formal procedure for documenting its own eventual dissolution. This is not a contradiction that can be easily resolved. It is a recorded fact. In the same buildings, scribes produced records of monumental achievement and timeless power, while simultaneously preserving and teaching the standardized template for systemic failure. The two sets of documents ran in parallel. One was a record of the system's intended function, to endure. The other was a record of its known failure mode, to predictably unravel. The physical tablets themselves attest to this. A king's triumphal inscription might be found in the foundation of a temple, intended to last forever. A lament text might be found in the rubble of a scribal school, discarded after the city had already fallen. Both are products of the same intellectual tradition, the same bureaucratic machine. Both were considered necessary records. The scribe's presence is felt in this duality. He is not a passive observer. He is an active participant in maintaining two parallel, seemingly opposing streams of information. He logs the king's glorious deeds. He copies the formula for the abandonment of cities. There is no judgment in his script, no hint of irony or despair. He is simply maintaining the complete record, fulfilling his function within the system. We are left looking at the raw data. On one side, a set of documents asserting permanence. On the other, a set of documents outlining a clear, repeatable process of decay. They are not from different eras, nor are they from opposing cultures. They are from the same time, the same place, often from the same hands. The real record is not one or the other. The record is the space between them, the silent fact of their coexistence. The work of connecting begins not in the mind, but on a table. Under a low, steady light, a researcher lays out the fragments. On one side, a tablet from an omen series. Its surface a dense grid of conditional statements. On the other, a piece of a city lament, its lines telling of a final, great sorrow. They are from different genres, written for different purposes, found in different layers of ruin. Yet here, in the quiet of the archive, they are brought into proximity. The simple, physical act of placing them side by side is the first step. The space between them is where the investigation now resides. We look again at the omen text, the one cataloging the health of the land. It states, with administrative clarity, if fungus appears in the grain of a man's field, that field will be diminished. It continues, if the date palms of the city wither from the top down, the city will know hunger. These are ground-level observations, the first signals of systemic stress, logged as discrete variables. They are the initial entries in a long and detailed report on the material state of the world, documented by the scribe with unwavering neutrality. Now, the researcher's finger traces a line on the other fragment, the lament for Eridu. It speaks of the god Enki turning from his city. The text then lists the consequences, and among the first is the failure of the surrounding marshlands, the drying of the life-giving waters. The lament for Nippur, in its own turn, records a great famine that preceded its final fall. The symptom logged in the omen list finds its final, catastrophic expression in the narrative of the lament. The two texts are describing the beginning and the end of the same process. This is not a thematic echo. It is a procedural sequence. The omen texts appear to function as a diagnostic checklist, noting the early, observable indicators of decay. The laments, in turn, read like a post-mortem report, documenting the full cascade of failure after the system has collapsed. The scribe, operating in two different modes, is tracking a single, continuous line of causation. He is noting the first crack in the foundation, and then, later, he is filing the official report on the building's demolition. A silence forms around this emerging connection. The dust in the air seems to hang motionless. For a moment, the millennia separating the two documents dissolve. They are no longer just artifacts. They become components of a single, coherent intellectual system. A system designed to observe, track, and record the life cycle of a civilization, from its first signs of illness to its confirmed death. The logic is cold, relentless, and entirely self-contained. To remain here, watching these connections form, is to share in a specific kind of attention. It is not about finding answers, but about learning to see the full shape of the question that the scribes have left for us. It is a commitment to observing the pattern as it reveals itself, piece by piece, across the entire archive, rather than turning away after inspecting a single, isolated fragment. The researcher shifts his focus, aligning a new set of tablets. The omen text now speaks of the built environment. If a fissure appears in the main gate of the city and is not repaired, the enemy will find that gate. And more pointedly, if the foundation of the city's great temple subsides, the god of that temple will abandon his house. The language is technical, focused on material integrity. The consequence is presented as a direct, almost mechanical result of a physical failing. This technical observation finds its liturgical counterpart in the laments. The central defining moment of every city lament is the departure of its patron deity. The lament for Ur describes its god, Nana, reluctantly but formally leaving his temple, the Ikishnugal. The lament for Nippur records Enlil and Ninlil abandoning their shrines. The omen provides the physical prerequisite. The lament records the metaphysical fulfillment. They are two sides of the same coin, one physical, one spiritual, both describing a foundational breach. The hand of the archaeologist rests on the table, still. The pattern is not just repeating, it is becoming more precise. The connection between the omen and the lament is not one of general foreboding. It is specific, causal. The physical decay of the most sacred structure is explicitly linked to the withdrawal of the organizing principle that structure was meant to house. The god's departure is not a random act of divine will. It is the named outcome of a failure in the material substrate. This implies that, for the Sumerian mind, the divine presence was contingent on physical and structural integrity. The gods were not abstract beings floating above the world. They were integrated components of a functioning system. If the system's core hardware, the temple foundation, failed, then the operating system, the divine presence, would predictably shut down. The scribe was not recording a myth. He was documenting a known point of system failure. We sit with this for a moment. The implications are profound. This is not a world of capricious gods and supplicant humans. This is a world governed by processes, by rules that apply even to the divine. The laments are not cries for help. They are acknowledgments that a critical threshold has been crossed and that a known, irreversible sequence has been initiated. The sorrow they contain is not for the unexpected, but for the inevitable. The investigation moves to the third tier of the system. The researcher pulls forward a text dealing with social order. The omen reads, "If a son answers his father back in the street, that house will be scattered." Another line observes, "If the word of the king's vizier is countermanded in the assembly, the king's authority will see a decline." The focus shifts from the integrity of the soil and stone to the integrity of the social and political fabric. Once again, the laments provide the final chapter. The lament for Nippur speaks of the time when the city's righteous laws were overturned, when justice was no longer found in the streets. The lament for Sumer as a whole describes a world turned upside down, where social hierarchies collapsed and trust between people was broken. The small-scale social infractions noted in the omen texts find their large-scale, society-ending conclusion in the lament literature. On a large screen, or perhaps a simple sheet of paper, the researcher maps the sequence. First, The Omen texts document agricultural decay. Then, structural decay. Finally, social decay. The laments for Ur, Eridu, and Nippur all follow this exact narrative progression in their account of the final days. The withdrawal of the god is followed by famine, the collapse of order, and finally the arrival of an external enemy who walks through the broken gates. The correlation is too exact to be a coincidence. We are not observing two independent sets of documents. We are observing a single unified system of knowledge. The Omen compilations function as the diagnostic manual, outlining the cascading symptoms of systemic failure. The city laments are the standardized case files, reports written after the fact, confirming that the collapse followed the predicted trajectory. The scribes were not just recording history. They were applying a pre-existing analytical model to current events. This realization changes our perception of the scribe. He is no longer a passive chronicler of events. He emerges as a technician, a highly trained analyst tasked with monitoring the vital signs of his civilization. His tone is dispassionate because it is the tone of a professional performing his duties. He is not expressing personal grief. He is logging data points against a known failure curve, and his work requires precision, not emotion. The fact that this template, this precise sequence of decay, was applied to Ur, to Eridu, to Nippur, and to Sumer as a whole, elevates the entire corpus from a local record to something far more significant. It suggests the scribes possessed a general theory of civilizational life cycles. For them, collapse was not a unique, unpredictable tragedy. It was a recurring, observable, and quantifiable process. The fall of any particular city was merely another instance of the same fundamental pattern asserting itself. The researcher steps back from the aligned evidence. The pattern is now visible, laid bare on the table. It is a structure of thought, preserved in baked clay, that has waited 4 millennia to be seen, not as a collection of separate myths or histories, but as a single, coherent schematic. The mystery is no longer whether a pattern exists. The pattern is undeniable. The new question, the one that now hangs in the silent air of the archive, is why. Why would a civilization dedicate its intellectual resources to documenting its own blueprint for dissolution with such cold, methodical precision? The question of why leads us away from the human world and toward the structure that governed it. The records do not speak of abstract forces or impersonal laws. They give this governing system names. The decision to abandon Ur, the lament states, was not a natural event. It was a formal resolution, passed in an assembly. At the head of this assembly sat two figures, named in the texts with hierarchical precision: Anu, the distant one, and his son, Enlil, the Lord of Command. The text is explicit. They held a council, they deliberated, and they voted. The destruction of one of humanity's first great cities was the result of a sanctioned procedural act. The language of the record is that of a verdict being handed down. The fate of Ur was announced. Its end was decreed. This is not the vocabulary of myth as we have come to understand it. It is the language of a court, of a boardroom, of an administrative body reaching a final, binding decision. The scribes who recorded this event did not depict a pantheon in chaos or a family of gods in a fit of rage. They documented a formal meeting, a quorum, and a resolution. The power that unmade the world was described as being orderly, deliberative, and bound by its own protocols. We must look at these figures as the texts present them. Anu is named first, always. He is the authority from which other authorities derive. In the god lists, the long catalogued hierarchies of the cosmos, his name sits at the pinnacle. Yet he rarely acts directly. His function is to be the origin point, the silent chairman, the ultimate arbiter whose existence validates the entire structure. He does not intervene. He presides. The system's foundational laws are bound to his name. He is the final court of appeal, a presence so foundational that he is rarely required to speak. Enlil is different. His name is always tied to action. He is the executor of the assembly's will. The texts refer to the word of Enlil as an irresistible force, the implementation of a decision already made. It is Enlil who is tasked with unleashing the great storm that scours the land. He is not depicted as a god of chaos, but as the opposite, the agent of a severe and structured order. His role is not to be angry, but to be effective. He is the chief operating officer of the cosmos, ensuring that the resolutions passed by the board are carried out to their specified conclusion, without deviation. A quiet descends when one contemplates this structure. The gods of the Sumerian pantheon, as documented in their own administrative texts, begin to look less like the passionate, unpredictable figures of later mythologies and more like the senior partners of a vast, cosmic bureaucracy. Their interactions are governed by jurisdiction, their decisions are ratified by committee, and their power is expressed through formal decrees. The universe they manage appears to operate on principles we might recognize: hierarchy, procedure, and the dispassionate execution of policy. The terror they inspire comes not from their caprice, but from their chilling predictability. Below this highest echelon are the local administrators. Each city had a patron deity, a figure whose temple was the literal and metaphysical center of the city's existence. For this was the moon god, Nana. His function, as implied by the records, was to manage the city's contract with the larger cosmic system. He was the intermediary, the local governor responsible for ensuring that remained a functioning, compliant component of the whole. The king, in turn, was Nana's earthly steward, the human charged with the hands-on maintenance of the city's physical and social integrity. The lament for provides a stunningly clear account of Nana's actions during the final crisis. The text records him traveling to the great assembly at Nippur to plead his city's case. He argues against the resolution to destroy He makes his appeal. But the assembly, presided over by Anu and Enlil, denies his petition. The verdict stands, and what happens next is the critical data point. Nana complies. He does not rebel. He returns to his city and, with great sorrow, carries out the protocol for abandonment. He is a loyal functionary of the system, even when that system decrees the end of his own project. Other figures appear with different functions. The goddess Inanna is often depicted as a force of disruption, of change, of the ambition that pushes boundaries. But even her actions are framed within the system. She seeks to expand her powers, but she does so by appealing to the other gods for their domains, for their divine attributes, which are listed in the texts like inventory. Her challenges are not random acts of chaos. They are attempts at a hostile takeover, conducted within the established rules of cosmic governance. She represents the system's capacity for dynamic change, a necessary if unsettling function. When the records detail dialogues between these entities, they are rarely personal or emotional. They are procedural. A god petitions another for a specific power or tool. A dispute over a boundary is settled by appealing to a higher authority. The texts read like memos, like legal arguments, like formal requests passed between departments. The scribes were not recording family squabbles. They were documenting the inner workings of a cosmic administration, noting the lines of authority and the protocols for interaction between its various departments. We are forced to consider that these names, Anu, Enlil, Nana, may not be characters in a story. They may be designations for the primary functions of reality as this civilization understood it. Anu is the principle of order itself, the unchanging constitution. Enlil is the executive power, the agent of enforcement. The city gods are the regional managers, responsible for local operations. They are the personified nodes of a vast, interconnected, and self-regulating system that governs everything from the sprouting of barley to the lifespan of a city. This framework is notable for what it lacks: a clear moral dimension. The destruction of Ur is not presented as a punishment for human sin in a way we would recognize. It is the result of systemic failure. The city, through the decay of its fields, its walls, and its social contracts, had ceased to meet its operational requirements. It had breached its contract with the cosmic order. The decision of the divine assembly, therefore, was not a moral judgment. It was a technical one. The project was failing, and the board voted to decommission it. Even the instruments of destruction are described with a kind of functional detachment. The texts speak of the great storm, or the seven who know no mercy, which are unleashed by Enlil's command. These are not portrayed as beings with motivations. They are weapons, tools deployed to carry out a specific task. The scouring of a city that has been marked for erasure. They are the demolition crew, dispatched with a work order signed by the highest authority. Their role is purely instrumental, a necessary function in the orderly process of dissolution. The human king's role becomes clearer in this context. He is not a supplicant begging for favors from unpredictable gods. He is the manager on the ground, whose performance is constantly under review. His primary duty is to maintain the city's infrastructure, both physical and social, in a state of good repair. The omen lists are his performance metrics, the diagnostic reports on his administration. If the reports show cascading failures, it is the king who is ultimately held responsible for the breach of contract that follows. The scribe, in turn, is the auditor. With his stylus and clay, he logs the data. The name of Anu is recorded with the same precision as the number of sheep in a temple flock. The decree of Enlil is entered into the record with the same dispassionate clarity as a receipt for a shipment of copper. For the scribe, these are not beings to be worshipped in a state of emotional fervor. They are the highest designators in the organizational chart of the cosmos, and his function is simply to maintain the accuracy of the record. There is a deep and unsettling rationality to this system. We are conditioned to see the ancient world as a place of myth and magic, of gods driven by passion and jealousy. The world described in these administrative and liturgical texts is something far stranger, a cosmos that runs like a machine, governed by laws and procedures that apply to all its components, from the smallest reed in the marsh to the greatest of the gods. The others are not mysterious because they are irrational. They are mysterious because they appear to be utterly, terrifyingly rational. We are left not with a mythology, but with a schematic. The names are placeholders for functions within a system. The laments are not cries of despair. They are final reports, closing the file on a terminated project. The true nature of these others remains veiled, but their role, as meticulously documented by the scribes, is clear. They are the board of directors for creation, the ultimate administrators of a system so vast and complex that the rise and fall of a city is little more than a line item in their eternal ledger. The mystery has shifted. It is no longer a question of belief, but a question of mechanics. The pattern is complete. The diagnostic manual and the case studies align with a precision that leaves little room for doubt. Yet, in the very coherence of this system, a new kind of disturbance emerges. It is not found in what is written on the tablets, but in the spaces between them. The investigation now shifts from the record to the silence that surrounds it, to the layers of dust and time where the scribe's hand goes still. The archive, once a source of answers, now becomes a map of all that is missing. We begin in the earth itself, in the excavated trenches of Ur. The archaeologist's trowel reveals the city as a book of layered strata. Here is the level of the great ziggurat's construction, dense with the debris of a thriving bureaucracy. Below it, the remains of older houses. Above it, a thick, dark line of ash and burnt brick, a destruction layer, clear and unambiguous. It is the physical confirmation of the lament's final verses. The city fell. The evidence is here, written in charcoal and ruin, but it is the layer directly above this stratum of fire that commands our attention now. It is a layer of clean silt, several feet thick, uniform and sterile. Within it, there are no potsherds, no discarded tools, no bones, no tablets. There is nothing. For a period of time measured in the slow accumulation of river mud, this place, once the center of an empire, was empty. The sound of a city was replaced by the whisper of wind over a barren mound. Life, administration, and record-keeping ceased. The silence of this sterile layer is absolute. An archaeologist can learn much from what people leave behind. But here, the primary data is the absence itself. It is a physical void in the story of the city, a caesura in its existence. This is not a layer of poverty or decline. It is a layer of non-existence. The system of observation and recording, which had operated for centuries, simply stops. The scribe's hand, which documented the coming storm, is not present to document the aftermath. This physical gap finds its direct parallel in the documentary record. The meticulous king lists, which provide a continuous, year-by-year account of Sumerian dynasties, reach the fall of Ur, and then they break. There is a tear in the fabric of recorded time. Following the last king of the Third Dynasty, there is a period for which no official chronicles survive from the region. The scribal schools fall silent. The administrative archives go cold. The continuity of the state, so central to their world view, is severed. The length of this pause is difficult to measure, but its presence is undeniable. The two records, the earth and the clay, testify to the same event, a total system interruption. The machine of civilization did not just falter, it shut down. The invisible antagonist is no longer a concept. It is a measurable void. A period of time from which no voice, no name, no record returns to us. The pattern of collapse, so clearly articulated, leads not to a new beginning, but to this empty space. One can feel the weight of that quiet. The space between the last recorded date of a fallen kingdom and the first of a new one. It is a silence that contains the unwritten histories of entire generations. Take a moment. Note the time where you are. The numbers on the clock continue their sequence without a break. Now imagine a gap in that sequence, a period where time itself seems to have been unrecorded, because the people who recorded it were gone. The system eventually restarts. New powers rise, new cities are built, often atop the old mounds. The scribal tradition is revived. But something has changed. The script is the same. The language is related, but the continuity of thought appears to have been damaged. The great literary compositions, the laments and the epics, are now copied as historical documents, as artifacts of a lost golden age, not as living components of a functioning cosmic system. The omen lists continue to be compiled, but their character shifts. They become more encyclopedic, more divorced from the immediate political and environmental realities. The scribe is no longer a diagnostician monitoring a living system. He is an antiquarian, a curator of inherited knowledge, preserving a science whose first principles may no longer be fully understood. The dispassionate technician of the Old Kingdom gives way to the scholar of a later age, looking back at a body of knowledge that is already ancient. This is a different kind of silence. It is not the silence of absence, but the silence of reverence. The knowledge is preserved, but it seems to have been sealed off, placed behind a pane of glass. The active, analytical engagement with the process of collapse is replaced by its careful, meticulous, but ultimately passive preservation. The manual for the machine is kept, but no one seems to be checking the engine anymore. Then, over centuries, another silence descends, a slower, more final one. The cuneiform script itself, the vehicle of this entire intellectual world for 3,000 years, begins to fade from use. It is replaced by the simpler, more efficient Aramaic alphabet, written on perishable materials like parchment and papyrus. The world of the stylus and the clay tablet, with its libraries of fire-hardened records, gives way to a world of ink and scroll, vulnerable to moisture and decay. The loss is not just of a writing system, it is the loss of a medium that was inherently archival. Clay, once baked, is permanent. Papyrus is not. The very infrastructure of institutional memory that allowed the Sumerian system to persist for millennia dissolves. The knowledge may have been translated, but its vessel was rendered fragile. The great library of the earth, where records could survive the burning of the city that housed them, was closed. This transition represents the ultimate victory of the invisible antagonist. The silence is no longer a temporary gap between layers of civilization. It becomes the permanent state. The vast, interconnected body of knowledge, the omen lists, the laments, the astronomical diaries, the legal codes, becomes unreadable. The scribes who could connect a withered date palm to the departure of a god are gone, and the intellectual framework that made that connection logical is gone with them. We are left with the final, and perhaps most profound, absence. The scribes of Ur and Nippur documented every stage of systemic failure with terrifying clarity. They recorded the symptoms, the sequence, the final outcome. They named the agents of destruction and the authorities who sanctioned them. They created a comprehensive, internally consistent model of how their world was unmade. But in all the tens of thousands of tablets we have recovered, one text is conspicuously missing. There is no tablet that explains why this system of knowledge was created. There is no preface to the omen lists, no introductory manual that states their purpose. The scribes never recorded their own methodology or the ultimate goal of their vast, centuries-long project of observation and analysis. They gave us the schematic for the machine's failure, but not the name of the machine itself. They left behind a complete diagnostic chart, but no record of the patient's identity. Was it a warning? A scientific record? A religious doctrine of fatalism? The texts themselves do not say. They simply perform their function silently and assume an audience that understands the context. That context is gone. It is the final erased layer, the one we cannot excavate. The silence that sits behind the entire corpus of cuneiform literature is the silence of first principles. The ultimate antagonist is not the loss of tablets, but the loss of the question to which these tablets were the answer. We are left holding a meticulously detailed solution to a problem that is never stated. The pattern of collapse is laid bare, but the reason for its documentation remains locked in a silence that will likely never be broken. The greatest mystery is not what the scribes knew. It is why. They felt it was so critical that this knowledge, above all else, be recorded. We have been looking at a history of loss, but what if that is the wrong frame entirely? What if this vast, meticulously maintained archive of collapse is not a record of something that ended, but a description of something that is always running? The silence that concludes the record is not an ending. It is a recalibration of our own perception. The scribe's work, seen in its entirety, ceases to be a collection of historical texts. It begins to feel like a single, sprawling piece of evidence for a condition we have not yet learned how to name. Consider the sheer bureaucratic inertia of the project. This was not the work of one generation, nor of a single city. For centuries, from Nippur to Ur, from Eridu to Sippar, scribes were trained in the same methods, copying the same templates, logging the same sequences of decay. This was not a literary tradition. It was a standardized program of observation, maintained with the kind of rigor we associate with a long-term scientific study. The consistency of the output implies a consistency in the directive, a purpose so fundamental that it persisted through the rise and fall of the very dynasties it was documenting. The subject of this vast study was not humanity. The records are strangely impersonal, focusing on the material and systemic, not the personal or emotional. The health of the barley, the integrity of a temple foundation, the flow of the rivers, the adherence to social hierarchy, these are the key performance indicators. Human lives are the consequence, not the cause. The scribes were not writing the story of their people. They were monitoring the vital signs of a much larger entity, an organism in which their cities were merely cells, and their kings were temporary stewards. This raises a question that the texts themselves never answer. For whom was this vast, dispassionate report being compiled? It was not for future generations of humans, as it contains no moral lessons, no advice, no hope. It was not a plea to the gods, as it records their decisions as final and their actions as procedural. Every detailed report implies a recipient. Every audit implies an auditor. The very existence of this meticulously kept ledger, with its balance sheets of order and chaos, suggests that somewhere an accounting was due. The worldview that emerges is profoundly alien because it is so self-contained. The system it describes requires no external explanation. The gods are not supernatural invaders. They are components of the system's own operating logic. The great storm is not a random act of nature. It is a programmed response to a specific set of inputs. The entire model is hermetic, a closed loop of cause and effect. It is the logic of a machine, one that contains within its own design the protocols for its own orderly shutdown. We are forced to confront the possibility that we are not reading myths or poems. We are reading a user manual, an intensely detailed, highly technical guide to the functioning of a complex system, with a lengthy and specific section on troubleshooting its catastrophic failure modes. The laments are not cries of grief. They are the final entries in a long and detailed error log, noting the exact sequence of events that led to a critical system crash. The sorrow is for the crash, but the language is that of the technician filing the report. This reframes the central concept of the Sumerian worldview, the contract between the city and its god. We have always interpreted this as a metaphor for religious faith. But what if it was not a metaphor? What if it was a literal, operational agreement? The city was responsible for maintaining a specific set of conditions: physical integrity, social order, ritual correctness. As long as these parameters were met, the larger system, personified as the god, provided stability and prosperity. A breach of these parameters was a breach of contract, and the system would then automatically initiate the documented protocol for withdrawal and decommissioning. In this light, the king is not a sovereign. He is a site manager, a custodian. His primary role is the maintenance of a delicate and complex piece of infrastructure. His piety is not a measure of his moral character, but a measure of his technical competence. The omen lists are his diagnostic reports, the regular system checks. The laments are the final accident investigation, filed after a catastrophic failure of his management. The entire structure of Sumerian civilization begins to look less like a kingdom and more like a high-stakes power station, with the king as its chief engineer. We must pause here. The air in this quiet space seems to thin. We came to these tablets seeking the history of a people, the poetry of a lost world. We have found instead what looks disturbingly like a schematic, a blueprint for a reality that functions on principles we are only beginning to recognize. The dust on these shelves no longer feels like the simple residue of time. It feels like the quiet dust that settles on a machine that has been switched off for a very long time. The great contradiction, the simultaneous creation of triumphal monuments and failure templates, is no longer a contradiction. It is the signature of any complex, high-stakes operation. On the one hand, you have the public-facing statements of success, the monuments that declare the system is working perfectly. On the other, you have the internal technical manuals, the disaster recovery plans that acknowledge the system's known vulnerabilities and outline the procedures for an orderly shutdown. The two are not opposed. They are necessary components of the same operational reality. A system this complex, with its functions and failure modes so precisely understood, begs the question of its own origin. The scribes documented its processes with the confidence of engineers who have the full design specifications. But the texts themselves are silent on where those specifications came from. The system of Anu and Enlil is presented as a given, a pre-existing condition of the world. It was not created by humans. It was discovered by them, or perhaps given to them. The manual is here, but the author is unnamed. This forces us to look again at the others, Anu, Enlil, and the assembly of the gods. If this is a managed system, then these are not deities in any sense we understand. They are the names given to the system's core functions, its governing board, its remote operators. Their decrees are not acts of will, but executions of code. Enlil's great storm is not an act of rage. It is the running of a script designed to reset a corrupted sector of the grid. Their coldness is not cruelty. It is the dispassion of a machine carrying out its function. Humanity's place in this schematic is unsettlingly ambiguous. The entire system seems designed to maintain a state of terrestrial stability. But for what purpose? Are humans the beneficiaries of this order, or are they merely its custodians? Or is it possible that humanity itself is a component, a biological substrate whose function is to perform the necessary maintenance, like bacteria in a larger biome? The texts are concerned with the health of the system, not the happiness of its inhabitants. This is not a story that can be neatly concluded. It is a thread that, once pulled, unravels our understanding not just of the past, but of the structures that govern reality itself. To follow this investigation is to accept that the archive is larger than we knew, and the implications run deeper than a single civilization. It is to remain present as more of the schematic is pieced together, not in search of a final answer, but to better understand the scale of the question being asked. The ultimate implication, then, is one of scale. The Sumerian scribes, standing at what we consider the dawn of civilization, were in possession of a complete, internally consistent theory of systemic collapse. They did not see it as a unique event, but as a recurring, predictable cycle. If this is true, then their records are not just a history of Sumer. They are a case study. The chilling possibility is that they were documenting a fundamental law that applies to any complex system that reaches a certain threshold of integration. The pattern they recorded feels too fundamental to be a local phenomenon. The sequence, environmental decay, followed by social fragmentation, followed by institutional collapse, has echoes we can recognize. We have been reading these tablets as a message from a distant past, a story about a people long gone. But perhaps that is our most profound mistake. Perhaps this is not a history at all. Perhaps it is a physics, a description of a process that, once initiated, runs to its conclusion, irrespective of time or place. A machine that is still running. The light in the room has not changed. It falls on the same piece of baked clay, tablet number 38. 4:22. 4,000 years have passed since the scribe's stylus left its final mark, yet the impression remains sharp, a precise and orderly testament. The object is no longer just a piece of evidence in an argument. It has become a thing in itself, a vessel of silence, its message delivered. Now it simply rests, indifferent to our gaze, its purpose fulfilled. It has outlasted the hand that made it, the city that stored it, and the world that understood it. The air around it is heavy with the accumulated quiet of archives, the stillness of things that have come to a final rest. It is a quiet that absorbs sound, that seems to push back against any attempt to fill it. This is not the silence of an empty room. It is the silence of a record that has nothing more to say, a machine that has completed its calculation and now stands idle. The scribe's dispassionate tone has finally become the atmosphere of the room itself, a calm, settled, and profound quiet. We can leave this room now. The mind travels beyond the climate-controlled walls, out into the night that has fallen over the low plains of Iraq. The wind, a constant presence in the laments, moves over the great sleeping mound of Ur. It finds no gates to rattle, no streets to fill with dust. It passes over the eroded stumps of the ziggurat, over the faint outlines of houses buried beneath the silt of millennia. The ruin is a landscape of profound and settled absence, a physical echo of the sterile layer in the earth. Here, under a sky dense with stars that have not moved from their ancient courses, the scale of time becomes palpable. The rise and fall of Ur, the meticulous work of its scribes, the decrees of its gods, all of it is a thin layer in the deep geology of this place. The real victor was never the invading enemy named in the texts. The victor was this slow, patient, and inexorable process of erasure. The wind, the sand, the silence, the quiet work of the cosmos, reclaiming its own. The question that drove this investigation does not dissipate in this vastness. It becomes part of it. It is no longer a question whispered in an archive, but one written into the landscape itself. The pattern of collapse, so clearly documented, hangs in the night air. It is present in the shape of the ruin, in the silence of the abandoned canals, in the very dust that settles on our hands. The evidence is no longer on the tablet. The evidence is the place itself. We stand as late arrivals to a process long since concluded. Our presence here, whether in person or in thought, is that of a witness after the fact. We have been shown the schematic. We have read the final report. We are left to contemplate the wreckage of a system whose operational principles were recorded with a clarity we can barely comprehend. We are the inheritors of a manual for a machine we did not build and do not fully understand. The hand of the scribe feels impossibly distant, and yet strangely near. One imagines him at his own work table, the clay damp beneath his stylus, the night outside his window just as dark. He was not thinking of us. He was not writing for a future he could not imagine. He was performing a function, a duty so ingrained that it required no explanation. He was maintaining the record, ensuring its accuracy, his focus entirely on the task at hand. The coldness of his work was the sign of his professionalism, and so he left no note of intent, no preface to his work. The system he documented was, to him, as self-evident as the sky or the river. It required no justification. The purpose of this vast, multi-generational project of observation and recording is the final, unexcavated layer. It is the silence at the heart of the archive, the one piece of the schematic that seems to have been deliberately omitted, or was never thought necessary to include. The great cosmic machine now feels like this ruin, a vast, silent, and dormant structure. We can walk its perimeter, we can trace its foundations, we can read the faded labels on its controls, but its power source is disconnected. Its purpose is a memory. We are left with the unsettling feeling of standing inside a technology of immense power and sophistication, but one that was switched off a very long time ago, for reasons the operators never recorded. The moon is rising. It is the same moon that gave the god Nana his name, the same light that fell on the streets of his city on its final night. It illuminates the mound with a clean, silver light, casting no judgment, offering no answers. It simply is. A silent witness then, a silent witness now. The record does not feel like a story that has ended. It feels like a description of a state that can and does exist. The tablets are not a history book, they are a field guide. They describe a recurring phenomenon in the natural world, like a storm or a tide, but one that operates on the scale of civilizations. Their final, chilling implication is that the process they describe was never confined to the land between the rivers. It is a form of knowledge that, once seen, cannot be unseen. It remains in the mind, a quiet and persistent hum, a blueprint lying dormant. The dust of these ancient cities seems to settle not just on the shelves of a museum, but on our own understanding of the world. The scribes were not warning of an end. They were describing a process. And so we retreat. The camera of the mind pulls back, leaving the ruin to its solitude under the Mesopotamian sky. The wind continues its work. The stars continue their slow procession. Nothing has been resolved. Nothing has been truly answered. An understanding has been reached, but it is an understanding that offers no comfort. It is the cold, clear understanding of the scribe himself. We are left where we began, with a piece of baked clay in a quiet room. It holds its lines of cuneiform, its account of an orderly and predictable end. It has been waiting for 4,000 years. It seems content to wait forever. It asks for nothing. It explains nothing. It simply remains,